So when little Danny Scott Dornfeld was about 4 years old, almost every sentence that I started in was this: when I was 3, and then I would pontificate, I would help people understand of my vast experience during that crazy year of 3 years old, what happened and how people should learn from it. So almost every sentence, when I was 3, this is what happened. And when I was 3, I learned this, and you should know better, Mom and Dad. And I think it got really old for them because they've never let me forget it. In fact, I apparently kept that sentence up when I was 3 until I was like 5 years old. Apparently 3 years old was the highlight, and everything's been downhill since then. It was the glory days of Danny's life. I wonder, do you know people like that? Are you a person like that? Maybe it's not when you were 3, but I'll bet there's a time in your life, isn't there? A time where, boy, everything seemed to click. A relationship was started, and that's when it was magical. When that was there, then life was beautiful. Or maybe it was when you got a new job, and everything was going, and it seemed like, oh, the sky's the limit. And you say, when I had that job, when I started that job, that's when it was at. Or maybe it was when you had your kids, and they were little, and you're like, when the kids were little, this was so magical. Or do you have the other way? When this happened, when Mom died, that's when things changed. When he left me, that's when it became different. What's the moment in your life, in your past, that you go back to again and again and again? In this new year, our new teaching series is Lies We Believe. It's the things that we look at in our lives, we say to each other and ourselves, the things that maybe have some worth, but the question is, where is God in the middle of it? And Pastor Taylor last week, as we started the new year, was talking about if this happens, then you'll be complete or happy. Something in the future, whatever that was. If you've missed that, it's on our website and Facebook. I'd love you to catch up because I think there's so much worth there. The lie we're talking about today is the glory days are behind us. You know, God's people, they didn't say when I was 3 and then they were talking, but they were focused behind them. You see, almost 600 years before Jesus, 587 BCE, they'd become a conquered people by the Assyrians. They were actually ripped away from their homeland, the promised land that God had gotten them to through Moses, and all at once they are not there anymore. They're a conquered people, taken away, and this has gone on for about 150 years that they have not been in. There's been some in Jerusalem, but many others that are apart from their homeland, and so they've heard stories, but they're the ones who actually experienced this brokenness, this pain, that watched the walls crumble and tumble. When they saw the rubble, they're not even alive anymore. And God's people are in disarray. In the time of Nehemiah, Nehemiah is not even in Jerusalem either. He's heard about it. Maybe he's seen it before, but now Nehemiah hears about this, and he hears that the walls have come down, and Nehemiah himself is in a key position. It's one of honor and praise. He is the cupbearer to the king when he hears this news that the great wall of Jerusalem that surrounded the city, those huge, monstrous things, they're rubble. He hears this, and in his position of power from a place of distance, all Nehemiah can do is just weep uncontrollably. I mean, his history, it's no more. What hope do they have for the future? Now he knows the walls are ripped down. Now what else can there be for God's people? The hope that they placed in was that someday they would come back to the promised land, to that place that God had gotten them to, and then things would be different. And God's people are just like Nehemiah. They're looking behind them. You remember when Moses brought us there? You remember when life was good? You remember when we actually had our home? You remember when we were safe and secure? Their great-grandparents knew it. They don't know it. I wonder, what's the thing for you? What's the thing as you look back, that moment, and maybe you're in it now? It used to be glory days, and now it's rubble. That's for Nehemiah and God's people where they're at. But Nehemiah, as he hears of this, as he he just emotionally reacts to it. He says this key thing as he prays out to God. He says, and I was cupbearer to the king. Now, to be in that position is kind of a huge deal, actually. It means, obviously, he passed the interview and gave all the glowing responses that a king needs. He passed the background check and the blood test. I mean, that was all good, apparently, and his credit seemed great. I don't know what the strenuous things were, but apparently it was enough that he was able to be next to the king. And yet, this position also had something else that's a lot harder. So when the king was thirsty, he would call for his cupbearer, Nehemiah, come over and bring that wine to me. And Nehemiah would promptly grab the goblet and he'd bring it to the king. There you go, king. And before he would give it to the king, the most essential part of his job came into play. He had to sip the cup. Because you can't give wine to a king that isn't tested for poison. So Nehemiah's worth, as great as this position is, his worth is only as much as the next sip and whether he would live or not. So apparently he's one of honor, but very expendable, right? He finds himself, as he hears this news, wondering what to do. And so he comes to the king, and this is huge. He comes to the king, he's had this revelation, he's prayed to God, and he comes to him, and the king kind of notices that something's bothering him. He knows Nehemiah well enough. He says, what's going on? And before Nehemiah responds, there's this huge moment. It's just a verse in the Bible. It's just in chapter 2, but you can't miss it, because I think it frames everything. Before he answers the king, Nehemiah prays. He lifts it up to God. And it's a reminder, if you're in rubble right now, if you're past the glory days seen behind you, like Nehemiah, we got to lift it up to God. That's what he does. And the king actually asks him, he prays, and then Nehemiah tells him what God has placed on his heart. This is scary for Nehemiah, right? To approach the king, who by all rights, whatever he requests, can say, whatever, Nehemiah, I'm the king. I don't have to listen to whatever you have to say. But the king listens. Now, what God has placed on Nehemiah's heart is these broken walls will come back. We will rebuild them. You can rebuild them, Nehemiah. Get that to my people. Approach the king. That's what he has on his heart. But he couldn't tell anyone. And he actually went to the walls to inspect it because he wanted to make sure that this might even be a possibility because he's pretty pragmatic. I wonder if he's kind of embarrassed. Like, did God really put this on my heart? Is this real? I didn't really hear words, or did I? Is God speaking to me? Is God saying I'm the one who has to do this? I'm sure those questions are in Nehemiah of all people, the one whose worth is just the next sip of wine, you remember. He could lay down his life for his king, but in the end, his life doesn't mean much. Would he be one that God is calling to? Well, I wonder, we're Lutherans, and for many of us, I think we read the Bible or hear these stories, and we think that God must be speaking to everyone under the sun before Jesus. Like, it's almost like this, I get this idea sometimes, like Nehemiah's coming to get his mail in the morning, he's picking it up, and his neighbor Joe gets here. He's like, hey, Joe, what's up? And Joe's like, not much, but God spoke to me this morning. He just said good morning. Hey, me too, cool, high fives, all right, we'll see you later. That's not how it went. In fact, in our Bibles, these separate books, they go generations without people hearing from God. This is not common. And so I think Nehemiah might be like one of us. You hear God or you think it's God and you're like, is this really? Truly? Because it doesn't happen very often. I have to be honest, I actually have, I think, heard God a couple times in my life, and I'm very hesitant to talk about that. It feels kind of mystical for people and not very Lutheran. We're just stoic and we smile inwardly, and if we're upset, we frown inwardly or furrow our brow a little more. We don't want to talk about anything like that. But I've had it happen. And you want to talk about glory days? I have a glory day for you. June 18th, 2013, my birthday. That's not why it's glorious, but that's part of it. Okay, that's not part of it at all. I had the day off. It was in my last church, and it was my day off, and it happened to be my birthday. So I was loving it, and I got a call. One of our members that had been sick for a while, it was her deathbed. It was time to go to the hospital, and I couldn't get out of it. I had to go, but I was kind of resentful. I'm like, it's my day off, and it's my birthday, and I know this might be a long process, and my heart wasn't in it. I'm sorry, pastors sometimes are human. Maybe not those two, but I am. And I got to the hospital room, and it's a large room, and it's full of people, her family and friends, probably like 20 people. And I came in there, and I was with them, and she hadn't been responsive for a few days. She's in bed, just sleeping. And so people just kind of, we were crying and sharing stories, and then a lot of silence. And we were probably there for about 2 hours, and there was no change in her. But as I looked around all at once, I got this feeling like I had someone it was like someone talking to me right next to me, like someone, like a clear voice that said, you have to talk now. Talk to them. Tell them right now. Tell them, talk. And it said, and talk, remind them about Romans. It's Romans 14. And this is the words I found. Whether we live to the Lord. Whether we die to the Lord. So whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. And I looked to this precious woman, and as I said that, I saw her breathe her last. And I said, she has claimed her baptismal promise. She is the Lord's. That doesn't happen. First of all, to get this feeling and this voice, and then to actually have someone as you're pronouncing the promise of God that they die. Maybe it happens to the two of you. It is not, that doesn't happen. But it did then. I look at that moment, I'm like, God is not far away. God was not somewhere else. Was that really God to someone like me? Are you kidding me? And then for God to claim her while I was speaking, that's incredible. I could look back on June 18, 2013 and say that is the day, that is the glory days. When I was in 2013, that's when God was there. I could cling to that. But like Nehemiah, I think there's something more. That God didn't just speak back there, that God speaks today. And God speaks not just to a few people, but God moves actually through you. Whatever the rubble in your life, whatever the pain, whether it's glory days or something else, it's so hard as you look at the new year. May you know this. God's power is bigger than your past. Whatever's making you feel worthless, God loves you more than that. And God's hope is bigger than any despair you can have. Anything that's bringing you back to that was the day that God says, I have something more. And I'm speaking to you and through you. And you are worth so much. You are worth so much that I will lay down my life for you. Let's not cling to the past. Let's look at the present and tomorrow and know that God's grace, God's Spirit is leading, just like Nehemiah. Amen.